looking down into that dent here in the primer of the cartridge. In the dent itself, you can see this kind of a odd shaped, maybe like a glove. It looks like kind of a glove or something. Depression, or actually it is a raised characteristic that's in that firing pin impression that corresponded when I saw that firing pin in the firearm. So these are two cartridge cases. This one over here, this TC4, is my test fire, the one that I fired from the pistol. And the G2 is the evidence cartridge case, compared side by side with each other. And that's what I would be looking at under the comparison microscope.
Okay, on State's Exhibit 385, this is D3. Is that basically the same thing?
Yes, it's similar. A lot of times what we'll do is we can turn the cartridge cases as we're looking at them to get the light to reflect off of the detail that's in that firing pin impression. So it may not be the same view as the previous one, because I'm turning them constantly, trying to get the best view as I'm doing my comparison. So again, this is showing the same firing pin impression, a test fire, the same test fire cartridge case, only this time it's item G3.
Okay, 383 is G4.
Same test fire cartridge case on this side, and the item G4 cartridge case, looking again at the firing pin impression, in particular this mark here at the bottom of the firing pin impression.
And G5.
Again, the same test fire cartridge case, only this time with item G5 cartridge case, again looking at the firing pin impression and that defect or that mark in there.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Guetta, at the crime lab, and you talk about gunpowder testing, etc., do you guys do any what they call GSR testing?
What you're referring to is the GSR letters stand for gunshot residue. But there are really two tests. I think the test that Mr. Lopez is referring to is what's called a primer residue test. Not only we talked about earlier this morning about gunpowder particles and debris coming out of the muzzle of the firearm, the burning gunpowder particles, unburned particles, the vaporous lead that comes out of the muzzle also. But sometimes there are debris that's contained in the primer of the cartridge case, the primer itself. And particularly there's two elements that you're looking for when you do a primer residue test. That's called, one of the items is barium, the other one is antimony. Those two compounds are found in primers of cartridges. And usually the way the test would go, if somebody fired a firearm, you would swab the suspected shooter's hands trying to recover these two metals. You would take these swabs, turn them into the laboratory, they would do some testing to try to see if there's levels of these metals present on the shooter's hands or on the subject's hands. They would report out it was either positive for primer residue, inconclusive for primer residue, or negative for primer residue. That's different than what we were talking about gunshot residue. That's a different topic.
Do you guys test for hand, what you call, I don't know exactly how you said it.
Primer residue?
Primer residue, yes.
We do not.
And why not?
I'm not sure what the reasons for that the state lab where I work now do not do gunshot or primer residue tests. But when I was working with the Albuquerque Police Department Crime Lab, we would do those tests regularly. We stopped doing them because that the idea of finding these elements on somebody's hands, people would imply that that was the person who did the shooting. It doesn't necessarily mean that that person did the shooting. All it means is that those metals were present on the hands. I could fire a firearm and come and shake hands with one of you and deposit those residues on your hands. We test my hands and test your hands. Mine may come back inconclusive. You may come back positive. It doesn't mean that you were the one that was doing the shooting. So that's why the APD at that time discontinued doing those tests.
And the New Mexico State Crime Lab doesn't do those testings?
We don't.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
So let me just talk to you a moment about what you just got through talking about, okay?
Okay.
So, I mean, one of the purposes of, well, you are a gunshot residue, You're certified in gunshot residue, correct?
Yes,
All right. And you're certified in a variety, at least two other fields of study, correct?
yes,
Tool marks and what's the other?
firearms.
Firearms, okay. And the office, your office, the crime lab is tasked with solving crimes, right? Or strike that. You're tasked with examining evidence, correct?
Yes,
Okay. And I'm not putting words in your mouth. That's your job, is to examine evidence and to reach whatever results you can reach, whatever conclusions you can reach, right?
that's correct.
Whether they're helpful for the state or whether they're not, right?
That's correct.
All right. And so in this case, you were asked to examine both a firearm, right?
Yes.
As well as the cartridges and spent casings, right?
Yes,
And you were asked to examine some clothing, right?
yes,
And you said a moment ago that this idea of gunshot residue, you don't test for gunshot residue because it might imply something that it turns out to be not true, right?
or primer residue, correct.
I'm sorry, primer residue. I made the same mistake Mr. Lopez did. Primer residue, right?
That's why the APD, the Albuquerque Police Department Crime Lab, stopped doing it. I do not know why the state lab, if they did or ever did,
Okay.
primer residue
Well,
tests.
the example you gave, and I'm curious, because the example you gave is if barium, was it barium or antimonium, right?
Antimony, both of them.
Okay, if those turned up on somebody's hands, the presumption would be that maybe they fired the gun, right?
That's a presumption, correct.
Okay, and we don't want to reach presumptions. We want to know the facts, and we want to garner whatever information we can from scientific facts known to us in any case, right?
Sure.
Well, how is the presence of either barium or antimonium on somebody's hands different, say, from somebody's DNA on a gun? Because the presumption, your example was if somebody had barium or antimonium on their hands, there would be a presumption that they fired the gun, right? That's what you said.
Yes.
And how is that different from, say, the presumption that just because someone's DNA is on a gun, that they fired the gun? It's not, right?
Objection is beyond the scope of
It is well within the scope. Well, we're talking about these presumptions, right?
Sure.
So for the same reason that just because barium or antimony is on somebody's hands, that doesn't mean they fired that gun, right? You've already said that.
That's correct.
For the same reason, by the same analogy, just because someone's DNA is on a gun doesn't mean they fired that gun, right?
Sure, that's correct.
Or because their DNA is on a steering wheel doesn't mean they drove the vehicle at the time of a shooting, right?
That's correct.
It's just present, right?
That's correct.
And so we don't want to draw, we want to be very, very, very careful about drawing false conclusions from scientific evidence, right?
Objection is argumentative, Your Honor.
It's not argumentative, I'm asking you a question. We want to be very, very, very careful about drawing false conclusions from scientific evidence, correct?
Sure.
And you're a scientist more than anything else, right?
Yes.
A man of science and men of science know that certain principles, right? You want to be able to reproduce something in the lab. You want it to be done by some sort of scientific method, right?
Yes.
So you'll agree with me that you do not go about your job in some sort of willy-nilly fashion. I mean, there is a strict procedure for everything you do, right?
Yes.
And just like when you were talking about analyzing the shell casings, you use specific instruments, you use cameras, you're very careful about matching these things up. You don't make wild guesses, right?
That's correct.
In fact, if you don't know to a degree of scientific certainty, which is the term that Mr. Lopez employed, then your finding is going to be inconclusive, right?
It could be inconclusive, or the other alternative is elimination.
Right. Something is eliminated, or it's inconclusive, or it's included, right? You reach a finding, or you don't reach a finding, or you don't know.
That's correct.
And your terms are way more scientific.
I believe so.
Okay. And you want to be very careful to do your job based on not only the protocols set up in your lab, but also the protocols and procedures set forth by the professional associations you belong to, and based on your certifications, right?
Yes,
Because the last thing you want to do is lose your certification.
that's correct.
All right, so you're going to, like for instance, the report you wrote on August 17th of 2015, these findings are based on not only your professional credentials and all the work you've done over the years, both with APD and the state, but they were done according to the techniques that you believe you need to use to maintain your scientific accreditation, right? Or your, your certification, not accreditation.
Certification and accreditation are two separate issues. Certification is a personal evaluation of my performance to be certified under AFTI guidelines. Accreditation is the laboratory as a whole that sets standards that we have to follow to meet accreditation guidelines or to meet accreditation. So those are two different things.
Okay, and forgive me, I didn't mean to jumble the two. What I'm getting at is when you reach your opinions, they're not based on guess, they're not based on conjecture, they're not based on anything except the procedures you've employed to guarantee that your results meet the standard necessary, which is to a degree of scientific certainty or to a degree of reasonable certainty, right?
Yes.
And none of what you're testifying to is meant to imply or subtly imply something. It's what's in your report, it's what you know, and that's what you're testifying to, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so let's talk for a moment about firearms. Now, Mr. Lopez gave the jury as well as you a nice tutorial about firearms and how they operate. The pistol we're using is a Beretta M5?
M9.
M9. And that's a commercial grade weapon. It's sold in the United States. It's sold at gun shows and in gun stores. It's widely available, right?
I believe so.
It's not a specialty gun, right?
No.
Okay. And the 9mm round is a very common round, right?
9mm Luger, yes, very common.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that might be the most popular round of ammunition in the world right now.
It's very popular.
Okay, at least for handguns.
Yes.
All right. The Beretta, you talked about class characteristics. Now, just off the top of your head, do you know if the barrel twist is right or left, and then what's the turn?
It twists to the right.
Okay, so it's a 2 to the right, or what's the number of twists it has?
Oh, number of lands and grooves?
Yeah, lands and grooves. I'm sorry.
6 lands and grooves with a right-hand twist.
And what that means is maybe a Smith & Wesson 38 might have a left 2, or a Glock might have some other configuration. It allows you the ability as a firearms expert to at least begin to reach some sort of conclusions based on the lands and the grooves or the tool marks on a bullet, right?
The class characteristics, that's correct.
And in this case, you had not only the suspect weapon, which is the Beretta, but you also had at least 4 projectiles, well, four partial projectiles, either the casing or the jacket or the projectile to look at in this case, right?
Yes.
And I mean, you were fortunate in this case to have a number of items to compare, right?
I'm sorry.
Well, you had sometimes, for instance, a shell or a projectile might not be intact enough to reach any sort of comparisons, right?
Sure.
And you were able to make comparisons, and you've reached a conclusion, correct?
Yes.
And your conclusion is that the 4 shell casings that were found at the scene were fired from the Beretta, right?
Yes.
And that's based on the tool marks on the casings, right?
The firing pin impression specifically.
Firing pin impression. And when we talk about tool marks, a pistol or a rifle is considered a tool, really, right?
Yes.
And so the firing pin, when it falls on the shell casing or when it falls on the cartridge, the impression of the firing pin, that's a tool mark, right?
Yes.
And so as you've shown, you're able to put the two together side by side, and you're able to realize certain characteristics on one and certain characteristics on the other, and they match, right?
Yes.
And then you reach your conclusions.
Yes.
Okay. You've also reached a conclusion to the degree of scientific certainty that either the jackets, that there were four partial or incomplete projectiles found, right?
There were 2 jackets and 2 bullets.
2 jackets, and you were able to reach the determination that the 2 jackets were fired from the Beretta, right?
Yes.
To a degree of scientific certainty.
Yes.
And that's not really left to question, right?
That's not left to question.
Now, the lead core of the projectile, you weren't able to reach any conclusions based on lands and grooves, right?
There were no rifling characteristics on the core because it's in the center and does not come in contact with the barrel. That's correct.
But based on the location that that lead core was taken from, Officer Benner's body, it's a logical conclusion that that was the core of the part of the jacket that you found, right?
Yes.
Okay. And again, that's not, it's really not in dispute, at least from your point of view, that that those projectiles were fired from the Beretta, right?
No, that's correct.
Okay. But what you aren't offering any testimony today is who fired that pistol, right?
That's correct.
And so if there is no dispute about where those bullets came from, I'm not contesting, you're the scientist here, right? You've offered your conclusions that those bullets were fired from that gun in a non-scientific sort of way, I'm telling you. But you can't offer any evidence about who fired that pistol, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And likewise, we talked for a moment, or you talked quite a bit on direct examination about let's talk about the ejection patterns for a moment. So when there's generally an accepted way to fire a pistol, right?
Sure.
But when you talk about muzzle position, you're talking about the end of the barrel, right?
That's correct.
And so without engaging in just crazy speculation, you aren't offering any opinion about what position the muzzle was in, or how the gun might have been being held.
No, I'm not offering that at all.
So when we talk about the muzzle position, you're just talking about the end of the gun where the projectile leaves the barrel or the muzzle, right?
The muzzle, correct.
Okay. And as you displayed to the jury, when you pull back on the slide, if there is a cartridge in the firing position, it will eject that cartridge, and you've given some measurements, and we'll talk about those in a moment, okay? But manually you do that, it will eject the complete cartridge, right?
Yes.
Okay. You looked at item number D1, right?
Yes, sir.
And D1 was an unfired cartridge for a 9mm Luger. It was a 9mm Luger made by Smith & Wesson?
Made by Remington.
Remington, I'm sorry. And it was unfired, right?
That's correct.
And to the best of your knowledge, let me make sure, that was D1, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And just to refresh the recollection of the jury, well, were you ever shown where D1 was located?
I don't believe so.
On the box that D1 came to you, it was determined that D1 was located in the Dodge Durango, right?
I believe there was some text on that, yes.
Okay. Would you have any reason to believe, and I'm showing what's previously been marked as Exhibit 180, that Exhibit 180 does that appear to be the cartridge that you received, or do you know?
It could be. It looks like all the cartridges that I examined, for sure.
Okay. That's certainly consistent with the cartridges that came into your office, right? Or
Yes.
into your laboratory. Now, the cartridges that came into your laboratory had writing on them, right?
Yes.
That's not atypical in this kind of case, right?
I'm sorry?
It's not atypical. I mean,
Oh.
when an item is received in the lab, there's going to be certain identification marks put on that item.
Not usually. The writing comes as it progresses through the laboratory. Usually latent prints gets items first if that item is going to be processed for latent prints, and they tend to write on the cartridge cases. That's usually where that writing comes from.
You don't write on them, but by the time you're looking at them, at least in this case, they already had writing on them, right?
Yes.
And in item number D1, that has no writing on it, right?
And the picture shows that's correct.
So presumably this item was photographed before it reached the crime lab, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now on item D1, you made a notation in your report about D1, correct?
Yes.
And you talked a moment ago about potentially a pistol, or the mechanism of cycling around through a pistol will leave tool marks, right?
It could, yes.
And it's not to say that it does or doesn't, but it could.
Yes.
And so when the cycling of the round that you're talking about is when you manually pull back the slide and the ejector ejects the cartridge from the firearm, right?
Well, the extractor grabs the rim of the cartridge case, which draws it out of the chamber. The ejector on the opposite side, that's what kicks it out of the firearm.
Okay. And your conclusion in this case, let me make sure I've got this right. Do you have your report in front of you?
Yes, I do.
Your conclusion was nothing remarkable was found on item D1, right?
In that regard, that's talking about attempted firing.
The submitted cartridge, D1, was examined for signs of attempted firing and nothing remarkable was found.
Yes, and there's another paragraph that selects D1 by itself.
Oh, okay. And you've testified that D1 showed no signs of either having been submitted for a cycling of the pistol or not, right?
No, it says that I could neither identify or eliminate that item D1 cartridge as having been cycled through the pistol.
Okay.
In other words, I couldn't either, again, identify it or eliminate it. There wasn't sufficient agreement of the marks that I did find.
Okay. There was nothing to suggest or not suggest that it had been cycled through the pistol.
That's correct.
Okay. And to reach any other conclusions would be just mere speculation, right?
Yes.
Based on what you know,
Yes.
based on the evidence in this case.
Yes.
So the state asked you some questions about trigger pull. So let's talk about this Beretta for a moment.
Okay.
When you examined the Beretta, and you talked about two different trigger pulls, one when it's being fired from a double action, and one from when it's being fired from a single action mode, right?
Yes.
But there wasn't anything especially difficult about firing this pistol, right?
No.
It seemed to have a normal trigger pull.
Yes, it functioned normally.
It functioned normally. And these guns are not gender specific, are they? I mean, this Beretta is not made for burly guys or petite women or people with exceptional hand strength.
No.
It's just a regular commercial pistol widely available in the United States.
Yes.
And when you were describing the mechanism, the part of the pistol, the part of this gun that you pulled back to ready the gun for firing, that's the slide, right?
Yes.
And you talked about the magazine well, and the magazine well is within the handle, right?
Yes.
And then obviously, unless one of us lives on a different planet, we know what the trigger is, right?
Yes.
And these are the parts. These are all parts of the gun that would be necessary to touch during either the firing or the loading of this pistol, right?
Yes.
The trigger, the slide, and the handle or the grip.
Sure. Yes.
Okay. So then let's talk for a moment about these ejector pattern averages that you came to, and you reached these conclusions in your report, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Let me have you refer, if you will, to page 4 of your report, talking specifically about the ejection patterns. Now, first of all, I just want to make this clear. I think this might be a silly question, but the ejector patterns in this case, you're not reaching any determination or even attempting to reach a determination about where the muzzle was located in this case or where the shooter was located in this case. All you're talking about is the ejector patterns or the ejection patterns for these casings that were discovered in this case, right?
We were just trying to determine how this gun ejects cartridge cases and what dimensions will they throw or eject cartridge cases to. That was it.
That's it. And so nothing about what you've testified to is deemed a suggestion about where the shooter might have been located, only where from your testing that the shell casings on average were 25.9 inches to the right.
I'm going to object at this point. I think the counsel's arguing what the jury must decide at this point.
No, I'm asking this witness what he's testified to, and thank you. So let me ask my question again. It looks like the pistol ejects the item AR1 pistol ejects cartridge cases on the average of 25.9 inches to the right and 26.7 inches to the rear, right?
That's correct.
So approximately 2 feet to the right and approximately 2 feet back, right?
Yes, sir.
Now, there's a reason that these cartridge in any firearm, whether it's a Beretta or whether it's a Glock or whether it's whatever, so long as it's semi-automatic, it's going to eject. If it's a right-handed shooter, it's going to eject to the right, correct?
Yes.
And there's a specific reason for that, and it's very practical, right?
Yes.
Because you don't want shell casings being ejected across your field of vision, right?
Well, to throw them in your face or anything like that, yes.
So you wouldn't want to be shooting a gun and having the hot casings come back right in your eyes.
That's correct.
That's why it goes out and to the right.
Yes.
And if it's a left-handed gun for a left-handed shooter, it's going to go left and to the right.
Well, I'm a left-handed shooter, and I just deal with that. But usually the casings don't end up on my face, but they could. But again, most firearms are designed for right-handed folks.
Okay. And which means the port, the ejector port is on the right-hand side of the pistol, as you've demonstrated. And there's nothing different about this firearm. It's set up for a right-handed shooter, right?
Yes.
Okay. Slow down.
You're exceeding the speed limit.
I'll slow down. You talked for a moment, or you talked a little bit about when you were test firing this weapon, it failed to eject when you were using a different kind of ammunition, right?
Yes.
Now, one of the things I'm sure you noticed during your examination of this pistol, it appeared to be very dirty, wasn't it?
It was not clean. It wasn't pristine. It was dirty.
Okay. And is there anything, I mean, as for this case in general, do you find any significance that it wouldn't eject a different kind of ammunition, or was that just something that you made an observation about?
We just noticed that. We didn't test it with any other ammunition to see if it would not feed other brands of ammunition. We just know as kind of a fluke by using that federal ammunition that it did not like federal ammunition.
Okay. But when you use the same brand of ammunition, the same kind of ammunition, that had no problem with ejecting, right?
It on occasion would jam, but the majority of the time it would function normally with the Remington ammunition. But it would jam on occasion.
But in this case, you were submitted 4 cartridge cases, four casings to examine, and there were 4 at least partial, either the core or the jacket for you to look at, right?
Yes.
And you know that 2 of the projectiles or parts of the projectiles were taken from Officer Benner's body, right?
Yes, of the jacketing or bullets, yes.
And then 1 was taken from Tabitha Little's foot.
Yes,
And then 1 was found, item number 28 was found in the roadway, right?
I believe so.
Okay. As far as you know, as far as you've been led to believe in this case, there were no casings found in the Durango, right?
That's all I examined, what we talked about.
Okay. And the one thing you did examine from the Durango was the unfired cartridge.
Yes,
And that cartridge showed no signs of having tried to have been fired, right?
that's correct.
There weren't any indentations on the firing pin?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, item number 480, which was identified by, it was your item number 44. That was the projectile from Tabitha Little's foot, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. And you talked a little bit on direct examination about some characteristics on that projectile that were different from the other projectiles, right? Or the other casings, the other jackets or the other fragments, right?
Yes,
And you reached the determination based on your expertise and based on your experience that was caused from a ricochet, right?
that's what it appears to be, yes.
Because under a microscope, it appeared that there were bits of concrete embedded in that projectile, right?
In addition to the damage where the damage was on the side of the bullet.
And the damage, for lack of a better term, well, let me ask that question a different way. If a projectile strikes something solid, it's going to mushroom. You explained that, right? Or generally, they're designed to mushroom and spread out in more of a symmetrical pattern.
If it hits perpendicular to the item, correct.
But in this case, regarding item number 44, which is the projectile from Tabitha Little's foot, it was misshapen, and there was scrapings on one side of that projectile, which indicated to you that it struck at an angle, right?
Yes,
Okay. And indeterminate what angle that might have been, right?
that's correct.
Okay. And I think your testimony was there was impact damage that suggested a slight angle, but the angle was unknown. Do you recall testifying to that?
Yes, I believe that.
And that would be consistent with what you observed, right?
Yes,
Impact damage at a slight angle, angle unknown.
correct.
Okay. You were shown photographs of Officer Benner's, his uniform pants, right?
Yes, I took those photographs.
Okay. And you were shown pictures of them today on the overhead projector.
Yes, sir.
And you were able to determine from your experience that one of the holes in the pant leg was the entry wound, it was the entry point, and the inside of the pant leg was the exit point, right?
After all my testing and examination, correct.
All right. And you're able to do that based on, at least to some degree, based on the fraying of the fabric, whether it's whether the directionality of the fabric is inward or outward, correct?
That's one of the characteristics that I looked at, correct.
Okay. The shirt you looked at, Officer Benner's uniform shirt, there were 2 defects, right?
Yes.
And when we say defects, it's a fancy word for a hole, like in this case, right?
Yes.
And when we say projectile, that's the word we use for bullet, right?
Sure. Yes.
And there's certain lingo that you use that's more scientific than just layman's terms, right?
You're hitting it right on the head. That's probably what we use.
Okay. And so when the 2 defects on Officer Benner's, on his uniform shirt, one appeared on the shoulder, right?
Yes.
And then one was shoulder and back, right?
Yes. One was in the right shoulder blade, and the other one was the upper left shoulder. Correct.
Okay. There were no what you determined to be exit defects, right?
That's correct.
So both of the defects on Officer Benner's uniform were entry only, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right, so you were also asked some questions about this, the gunshot residue, right?
Yes.
And this is part of your expertise, correct?
Yes.
Now, have you seen the Office of the Medical Examiner's report in this case?
Yes.
All right. You actually reached some conclusions that are in more detail regarding the gunpowder or the gunpowder residue than the Office of the Medical Examiner, correct?
I test the clothing. I don't look at the decedent or anything like that. I just look at the clothing, use the medical examiner's report to kind of confirm what I'm suspecting is a entrance wound, because those are the ones that I want to process, those holes.
Okay. And again, with the gunpowder residue test, you use the same accepted scientific method that you've been taught, right?
Yes.
And with the same exactitude as you would when you're examining the pistol, right?
Yes.
And you set up a test, in essence, where the firearm is fired, in this case the Beretta, right?
Yes.
And it goes through layers of cloth, right? Am I right about that?
We use one test material for each shot, and we shoot it 4 times at each distance.
And it's what, 3, 6, 9, 12, or what's the distance?
I started with 1 foot and ended up out to 8 feet.
Okay, so the range you're looking for is 1 to 8 feet, right?
Somewhere in there, yes.
Okay. And if it's more than 8, then you don't know if there's spat or if there's residue at 8, then you'd say 8 feet or greater, I guess.
No, usually I shoot that long-range shot to try to get it to stop depositing gunpowder particles on the test material. In this case, I was still getting some, but at that point, based on what I found during my testing of the clothing, didn't make any sense to go any further than that.
I got it. And again, with the specificity, you reach these determinations, and we'll get to the exact determinations in a moment, but these aren't guesses, right?
No.
And so hole number 1 and 2, that's the pant leg hole.
Yes,
right?
sir.
Entry is 1, exit's 2. Entry's on the outside of the leg near the knee, right?
Yes.
And you explained why you didn't find any gunpowder residue on hole number 2, right?
That's correct.
And that's one of the reasons you determined hole number 1 to be the entry wound or the entry defect, is because that's where the gunpowder residue was, correct?
That, and then also looking at the fibers on hole number 2 protruding out.
Okay. And you determined, if I'm not mistaken, that the muzzle was located greater than 2 feet from that defect, but less than 6 feet.
That's correct.
All right. And what that means, and please tell me if I'm wrong, is that the muzzle, the end of the gun, was less than 2 feet from greater than 2 feet from Officer Benner's leg, but less than 6. So within 6 foot proximity to Officer Benner when that muzzle was located when the shot was fired.
That's correct on that shot.
On that shot. Now, on hole 3, which is right shoulder blade, correct?
Yes,
Hole 3, you made the determination that was greater than 3 feet, but couldn't reach any other conclusions, correct?
that's correct.
Okay. And then hole 4, it was greater than 3 feet, but you couldn't reach any other conclusions, right?
That's correct.
But your finding for the jury is that the defect on Officer Benner's pant leg was greater than 2, but less than 6. That muzzle was located within 6 feet of Officer Benner when he was shot in the leg.
Yes.
Okay. May I have a moment, Judge? Also, so, Mr. Gitt, I forgot something. When we're talking about distances, you also tried to establish a distance, like with all the defects, you wanted to try to attempt to establish a distance for the defect in the bottom of the Nike shoe, right?
Once I realized that it was a ricochet in conjunction with examining the bullet and also examining the shoe, there was no reason to do a distance test because it was in the bottom of the shoe and it's the second target. It struck something first and then hit the second target.
And in your report, you indicated the hole was tested for the presence of lead. A very small lead reaction was found.
Yes,
And you concluded that paragraph regarding the shoe. No distance can be determined for hole 5. Hole 5 is the hole in the Nike shoe, right?
that's correct.
You were asked about the item of evidence AR-1B. AR-1B, if I'm correct, was the magazine that was located in the magazine well of exhibit AR-1, which is the Beretta, right?
I don't know where it came from. It just came separately from the firearm.
Oh, it came separately.
Yes.
And then C1, which was also a magazine, right?
Yes.
The notation on that was C1 was located in the Impala.
I believe it was on the container. That's correct, on the bag, correct.
Now, you weren't involved in the evidence collection, right? This
No,
is like a
sir.
silly question. But
No, sir, I was not.
you just get it in the lab and it's packaging, and you have to rely on what someone else has written on it for some of these questions about location, right?
Yes,
Okay. And item G28, you were asked about by Mr. Lopez. That's the projectile or partial projectile that was recovered in the road on Pine Street, right?
yes, the jacket.
It was the jacket. All right. And that was certainly you matched that projectile to the casing. You matched that. You were able to match that as having been fired from the Beretta.
That's correct.
Okay. But you weren't called upon to make any determinations, either the angle of any sort of shooting reconstruction, right?
No, I was not.
Yeah. Just there was a bullet, a projectile laying in the street on Pine Street, and that's what you know.
That's off the text on the container, correct.
Okay. Thank you for your time. Pass the witness.
Just real quickly, Mr. Guetta. Again, you testified on direct examination, and I think counsel went into the type of bullets. You had said that there's basically 2 types, or there's hollow point, and then you mentioned another type of.
A full metal jacket, which there's no hollow point. There's different, there's numerous different bullet styles out there.
Now, what's the difference between a hollow point and a
Full metal jacket.
full metal jacket?
The only difference is that the hollow point has a dent or a hole in the tip of the bullet, right in the center of the bullet. And where a full metal jacket, there's no dent. It's just a full covering, smooth, pointed, kind of conical shape nose on it. That would be a full metal jacket.
And what is the difference between when it hits an object, a full metal jacket as compared to a hollow point?
A full metal jacket bullet tends to penetrate more because there's nothing to make it flatten out and mushroom and slow down. So it tends to just bore its way through the object that it's going through. Where a hollow point is designed to flatten out when it hits the target and mushroom, slow down, stay in the target, and also create a larger, what we call wound cavity, causing more damage.
And all of the casings, the cartridges were of the same class, is that correct? Or the same brand?
Same brand. They had characteristics of Remington Golden Saber brand hollow point ammunition.
From Remington, correct?
From Remington.
Okay. There was no federal cartridges or casings or anything submitted to you for examination?
No.
Or none that were in the magazines?
No.
That were submitted, okay. They were all of the same type, okay. Now, they asked you a little bit about chambering and indicating that D1. You're not saying that it could have been changed?
Objection is leading.
What you're indicating, Mr. Yeah, it doesn't mean that, he asked you, well, you can't say that it was chambered, but you can't say that it wasn't chambered, correct?
Or run through the action, that's correct.
Run through the action.
Yes.
Now, in your experience and in your long career, Mr. Guetta, is it common or uncommon to see that type of casing having been chambered or ejected and placed back into a magazine?
That happens very routinely. Law enforcement officers, back when I was out in the field, you would come home at the end of the day, unload your pistol, take the magazine out, take the one that's in the chamber out, and leave it that way till you're getting ready to go back to work. Then you would load the magazine back in, chamber around, and take that one that you had in the chamber originally, put it back on the top of the magazine. That was routine.
Okay. And when you're unchambering a weapon, the semi-automatic, you have to slide the slide so it'll eject, correct?
Correct.
You can't just open it and pick the thing out.
No.
Okay. And by doing it several times, it's going to leave markings after markings, which makes it difficult for you as a firearm examiner it would make it more difficult to pin it down to a particular weapon?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
It just depends on how it leaves marks.
Okay. Now, also, they talked about the G28. The hole number, I believe, number 1 and number 2 in the pant leg, correct? You didn't find any jacket or lead core there was never nothing found in the leg. It went right through, correct? That particular shot went straight through the leg.
Apparently.
Okay. Now, you also indicated at times they separate. The jacket and the lead core separate, correct?
Yes.
So, in your experience, Mr. Guerra, well, you didn't find any defect in the left pant leg.
No.
Okay. So it would be reasonable to believe that the legs weren't in a situation where it hit both.
Objection is cause for speculations beyond the scope of this.
Okay. Mr. Guerra, there was no entry or exit on the left leg, correct?
I did not find any other holes in the left leg. That's correct.
And you indicated that G28, in your experience, in your expert opinion, would it have been possible for that jacket to have gone through the leg, fired off, separated from the core, and ended up somewhere else?
Sure.
Okay. Now, I guess, Mr. Guerra, the bottom line is that the Beretta that you tested, the 9mm Beretta, was fired, the rounds, the casings, And the jackets that were found in Officer Benner, basically it was the weapon that shot and killed Officer Benner.
Yes.
And it was the 9mm that shot and hit Tabitha Littles.
Yes.
Okay, may this witness be permanently excused, Mr. Lopez?
The state has no objection, Your Honor.
No objection. Okay, may be excused, thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
There are no exhibits there.
No.
Can I have a 2-minute break before we go on?
Let's take a 5-minute break, okay?
All right.